Good morning. This is Barry Jones with Standards Plus History Academy. You can find my content on sphistory.com or you can just go to barryljones.com. Either one will get you to the same place. We are continuing on with the JFK assassination, and today we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the Medical Manhattan Project and the how it factors into the JFK assassination and the Mexico City story, et cetera, et cetera. This should be episode, I believe, 34. 34. Yeah, I think it's 34. This is Thursday morning, January or February 15th. So, as you know, if you've watched any of my previous episodes, we always begin with a question. And I've got several questions today I want to look at. I hope you'll oblige me. Um, First, what was Medical Manhattan? That is a question I want to answer right off the bat. What was the purpose of it? And then how did it work? And then there's some alibi things that are going to come into play here. There's two Jackson alibis we're going to talk about today. There's a couple Texas alibis, and then there's the Mexico City alibi. In the lead up to the assassination, there was the cover story that was being prepared, as we've learned, to point the finger of blame at Lee Harvey Oswald. And in every one of his movements, you'll notice there's always two things simultaneously happening. There's the real purpose, and then there's the fake purpose. And the fake purpose is, the alibi for why the person, or why in this case Lee Harvey Oswald, is really there. So there's a pattern, and I want to highlight that pattern today. So yesterday we learned that the about the different participants. We started with how the CIA, the government, first of all, gave Dr. Ojner a task, and that was to find a cure for cancer, which they knew an epidemic was in the offing. But simultaneously, they gave him a covert response. That was public, but the covert responsibility was to weaponize cancer. And it was all about taking out Castro. Castro was public enemy number one, as you see here by this picture. And we've been trying and trying. We've tried every crazy kind of means to take him out, and we just couldn't succeed. So the new and improved version or method is to weaponize cancer. And of course, the beauty of it is you'll never know it's an assassination. It'll look like someone died of natural causes. So that's what he's doing. So when he recruits people to this task, this project, he's got the reputation, the public reputation that he's working to cure cancer. And that's how that's the carrot that he uses to get Dr. Mary Sherman. That's the carrot he uses to get Judith Ferry Baker. The experts, the two experts in this whole project are both females. One's an accomplished doctor, the other one's just a student. Now, she's really not even a student yet, and she's kind of a invisible hand, so to speak. And he lures them to New Orleans with the promise of curing cancer, and they're Dr. Mary Sherman was going to have her own clinic and her own lab, and et cetera, et cetera. Her career would be made. Judith Ferry was going to get to go to Tulane Law Med School without having to go to undergrad. He was going to pay her. Her way was going to be greased for her. So they both come down, and they're joining all these CIA hands. You'll notice Dr. Mary Sherman is not CIA, and neither is Judith Ferry. They're about as far removed from that as possible as can be. And then they're joining quite a cast of characters. First of all, Dr. Ojner, who's working for the CIA. Secondly, Guy Bannister, who's CIA, and is going to be the sort of the overlord of the project. He's kind of he's definitely Lee Harvey Oswald's handler. He's going to be given orders that summer. David Ferry's down there. He's CIA. Clay Shaw is the CIA point man who's paying for everything in New Orleans. Uh, you know, Jack Ruby's going to make an appearance. He's mobbed up. And of course, he has been very closely associated with Lee Harvey Oswald in the CIA's Operation Mongoose, running guns to Cuba and things of that nature. It's just interesting to see these two, both of them relatively young, naive, but experts in their field, inserted into this world of intelligence. And there's two things simultaneously going on. And of course, they don't know that. And so they arrive. And the project itself, we learned yesterday about all the participants and how everybody was involved and their roles to play in it. But today, what I want to focus on is the actual what. Yesterday was the who. Today is more of the what. So, what is the medical Manhattan? Well, how did it work? Well, yesterday we talked about how there were three labs. Two of the houses that are used as labs were owned by David Ferry, and the one house held all the mice and lots of mice because every day they were testing new mice. And so that's what they called the mouse house. And across the street, literally right across the street on Louisiana Avenue, downtown New Orleans, or on the outskirts of New Orleans, Ferry's other house, which was an apartment, and that's where Judith Ferry did the injections. So Oswald, whose job was to transport, he was the runner. So he'd go across the street and he'd get the mice. He'd bring them over to Judith, and Judith would inject the mice with these cancer cells from the polio vaccine. And the mice would grow these tumors on their bodies. And when they did, Judith Ferry would, after a period of time, she would cut the tumors. She'd kill the mice, she'd cut the tumors off and put the tumors in a blender basically and macerate or blend the tumors up and create what she called cancer soup. And then in that container full of cancer soup, then Oswald, the runner again, would take the cancer soup to lab number 3, which is where Dr. Mary Sherman's waiting with the linear particle accelerator, and she would zap it with radiation and make it more lethal, more toxic. And then they would bring the radiated cancer soup back to Judith Ferry. Oswald go back across the street, get a new bunch of mice. They would inject uh, the radiated cancer soup into, this new batch of mice, and the tumors would grow back faster and bigger. And she would cut them off again, macerate them again, create the cancer soup, send it off to lab number 3. Judith Ferry or Dr. Mary Sherman would zap it again with the linear particle accelerator, and then back it comes to Judith Ferry. And they just keep repeating this process. They keep repeating it and repeating it until the mice are dying in 28 days. The goal was 28 days. They wanted to be able to, from injection to death, be 28 days. And so when they get to the point that they are killing the mice in 28 days, they now are ready to move on to the second stage. The second stage are monkeys, not any kind of monkey. These are the marmosets, as you can see. These are small monkeys. So they're increasing the size of the test subject a little bit. And they would do the same thing. Inject the marmosets with the cancer soup, cut off the tumors, macerate the tumors, radiate the tumors, send it back, a new round of marmosets, new cancer soup, radiate the new cancer soup back to Judith Ferry again. And that's how it went all summer long. We've been talking about Judith Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald working these cover jobs at Riley Coffee. From the first day they worked at Riley Coffee, they were beginning work on Medical Manhattan. And that carried them through the summer. And when we get to the point where they're killing the marmosets in 28 days, they move on to the next stage. And the next stage are the Asian rhesus monkeys, these green ones on the left. And same thing. You work through the process until 28 days, you're killing the Asian rhesus. And then you move on to the African green monkeys, which are the larger monkeys. I may have these reversed here. The African green. It looks pretty green there on the left. So either way, you're now in your larger monkeys. And same thing, you're injecting them, you're radiating the cancer soup, you're cutting off the tumors, radiating the cancer soup, and then re-injecting the new round of monkeys. And when you are killing those monkeys in 28 days, you have worked through the mice and all the monkeys, the 3 different kinds of monkeys. And now you are ready for the last stage. The last stage is the human test. And of course, this is what matters because this is the whole point of the project. You can kill mice and monkeys all day long, but it's really about killing Fidel Castro. And so in this particular case, they were able to secure 3 death row inmates from Angola prison down in Louisiana. And these death row prisoners were going to be their test subjects for the final test, the human test. And the test was going to be conducted at East Louisiana State Mental Hospital. It had to be in an out of the way location, a place where away from prying eyes, a place where they could have complete privacy. And so it's going to be in Jackson, Louisiana. So you figure, you know, they would use death row inmates because, I guess, I don't know if they asked for volunteers or how they secured that. I haven't ever gotten that answer, but they got 3 of them. And so on the day that they're going to go conduct this test, the entourage, and the reason we know about this is because all kinds of witnesses, this is getting into the alibis now, all kinds of witnesses saw him. Uh, Clay Shaw is the driver. Remember, he's the guy who's over, he's the top CIA guy in New Orleans. He's the guy with all the money. So he's got a big black Cadillac that he's going to drive. And David Ferry's going to handle the injections. I told you David Ferry was a Renaissance man. He had worked closely with Judith Ferry throughout the summer, watched what she did, and in fact, he did some of the injections, so he could handle that. They're going to use Judith Ferry for something else in this whole process. So David Ferry is going to go with them and handle the injections, and Oswald's handling the materials like usual. So off they go, headed towards Jackson, Louisiana, towards this mental prison or this mental institution. Here's where things get a little interesting because this is where the intelligence side of this kicks in. They stop. Now I've put a map up here and you can see uh, if the map extended right past Clinton, you would go to New Orleans. Highway 10 goes right into New Orleans, but they're heading west. And so they come into Clinton, which you can see is it's about the halfway point before if you just stay on Highway 10, you'll end up at the Louisiana State Mental Hospital in Jackson. But they stop in Clinton, and they do so on the same day that there is a voter registration, an African-American voter registration drive going on downtown at the courthouse. And this is the courthouse where it was being held. This is the day after Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech in Washington. And it so inspired the African-American population in the South that all throughout the South in these small towns, African-Americans decided to go down and register to vote. They were inspired by Martin Luther King's words. So it's all African-Americans waiting in line to register to vote. Up to the curb pulls this black Cadillac. And that attracts attention because it's a fancy car. And so people are standing in line and have nothing else to do. They turn around. This is before the cell phones. Everybody had to be buried in the cell phone. They're just standing there waiting their turn. So they're looking around and they see this black Cadillac pull up. Out pops Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Lee Harvey Oswald. Clay Shaw goes over to the payphone. There's a payphone right there and makes a telephone call. Meanwhile, Lee Harvey Oswald jumps in line. I can imagine people looking around like, what are you doing? He's the only white guy in line. And he's talking and the sheriff is there. And he notices this and he pays close special attention to this entourage that has just arrived. He's watching Oswald. He's standing up by the door where the table is, but he's just scanning and he's watching. And he says later that, Oswald stood out like a sore thumb. When he gets to the table, the sheriff questions him and then goes over and questions Ferry and questions Shaw. So he had a conversation with all 3, trying to find out what they're doing. And Oswald tells him, well, I'm here to register to vote. But he didn't have any of the paperwork that you need to register to vote. So that didn't go over. And he says, I'm also here to inquire about a job. I hear there's jobs at the mental hospital. I'm wondering what the process is for me to get a job. And so he's saying this to just about anybody who will listen. He tells the sheriff this. He tells the person at the table who's trying to register him to vote. And he's asking, what do I do to get a job at the mental hospital? He just keeps asking. And the sheriff is convinced and lets him be that they're here for him to register to vote. He wasn't sure about that, but he was sure about him looking for a job because he made such a point about it. And then afterwards, when he is instructed where to go and who to talk to at the hospital, they leave, they get back in the car, they leave, and on they go to East Louisiana State Mental Hospital. This is a picture of the hospital. You can see it's kind of a rundown looking place. Reminds me of the place in New Orleans where Dr. Mary Sherman is working with the linear particle accelerator, that rundown uh, health institute, the backwater part of New Orleans. They always seem to gravitate to these kind of locations because they're out of the way and they're not in, uh, you know, nobody wants to be there. And so anyway, uh, at that point, they meet the prisoners who are traveling by a prisoner transport, a van, and they drive in together into the mental hospital through the grounds. They're led in through the security gate together. It's the van in front and Clay Shaw in his Cadillac in back. And they drive around to a back building, kind of an outbuilding. It's not attached to the mental hospital itself, the main building. And out gets three prisoners from the prisoner transport, and they're escorted into the facility. It's a small little, like I said, a small little outbuilding. And then Oswald gets out. He's carrying a package, and he's got what looks like two or three thermoses with him. And then David Ferry has a medical bag, and Clay Shaw gets out. And they all go into this little outbuilding. And that's where David Ferry presumably handles the injections. Uh, Oswald is carrying the material in those thermoses, and they handle the injections, and they come back out this time without the prisoners. The prisoners are left in the outbuilding in on hospital beds, and now they wait, and Clay Shaw and David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald come back out to the Black Cadillac, get in the car, and they leave. Now, before they leave, Oswald goes to the main building, into the main office, and secures a job application. And that is the whole alibi for the trip. If anybody ever asks what the three of them were doing, they have all kinds of witnesses in Clinton that said, well, they were here. One of them was here to register to vote, but he was looking for a job, and we sent him to East Louisiana Mental Hospital to get a job application and talk to the certain person. So alibi secured. That was the whole point of all the job stuff. It was about getting an alibi, securing an alibi, so that they have a reason, a fake reason for why they really came to Jackson. The real reason was to conduct this test, to inject these prisoners. The fake reason is the job. Now they have to wait a couple days for the injections to take. And this brings us to our second trip to Jackson. The second trip to Jackson is this time just two people. It's Oswald and his lover, basically, by this point, Summer, Judith Ferry. Judith Ferry is going to do the blood work, and they're going to test to see if the cancer, I mean, they've created a bioweapon, and what used to take 30 years to become, to kick in, now they're hopeful that it kicks in 2 days. That's how potent this has become. And so they're going to go back, and she's going to do the blood work, and Oswald's going to follow up and do his alibi stuff again. So off they go to Jackson. They're not driving the black Cadillac this time. They have an old beat up car, and they're driving along. And when they get to Jackson, they don't stop in Clinton this time. When they get to Jackson, there's no point in stopping in Clinton. The Clinton thing was all about getting directions to Jackson, and they don't need to do that again. So they go to Jackson, and as they enter the grounds, Oswald goes back in and hands in his application. And then they go around to the outbuilding, and he drops Judith Ferry off, and she goes in and begins doing the blood work. And she tells the story in her book how, she couldn't get she was not going to actually be doing, somebody did the blood work for her as far as collecting the blood. All she was going to do is test the blood. So she didn't actually have to draw the blood. So she didn't actually have contact with the prisoners. But there was a lot more blood than she had been led to believe would be produced by one prisoner. She thought there was just one. And so she starts questioning the guard and wants to see the prisoner. And he says, well, you're not supposed to see the prisoner. Well, I want to see the prisoner. I've got to see the prisoner. She just maintained, she was very persistent. So he let her see one of the prisoners. And the guy was in a hospital bed. He was thrashing around. She watched him for a minute. He was thrashing around. He was in obvious pain. He was chained to the bed. He was just thrashing, thrashing, thrashing. And of course, she did the blood work, and she could tell right away that the cancer took, the bioweapon worked. And when she comes out, Oswald, but meanwhile, had gone back to the main office and was talking to one of the office personnel about the job again. That's all he's there for, to drive and to talk about the job. So he comes back, picks her up, and as they're leaving, she tells him the story about what she saw, and she describes the prisoner. He says, well, that's not the same prisoner. That's not the same prisoner I saw. And so that's when they figure out that there's three of them. Oswald knew there was three, but he was kind of trying to hide it from her that there were three people were fixing to die. And she figures it out. And she's like, oh my goodness. And this leads to a sort of a crisis of conscience with her. And she ends up writing a letter to Dr. Osner objecting to what they're doing, using human beings for testing. And now that the bioweapon project is successful and all they got to do now is wait for them to die, Osner's done with Judith Ferry. It's kind of a rash move on her part. Could have been a very dangerous move on her part. He flies off the handle, gets furious, ends up uh, telling her that he washes his hands of her basically and says, "You're not going to Tulane. Everything I promised you is done. You're out of the project. You're out of my hospital, out of my clinic," and he sends her back to Florida. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. That's going to be a couple weeks down the road, but I wanted to illustrate the point that she was innocent in this whole thing. She didn't realize what was going on. And when she came to test the blood, uh, maybe she knew it was a prisoner. Maybe she knew it was a human. I mean, she had to have known. But when she actually saw what they were doing, she actually she felt bad. She felt very remorseful about it, and told Dr. Osher she wasn't going to be a part of this anymore. She said, I thought I came here to cure cancer, not make a bioweapon. It's about this is when it all kind of, she, the realization settles on her that she realizes what she's been a part of. And she's horrified by it. She's really horrified by it. Anyway, now that they've had two trips to Jackson to do the injections and to test the blood work, and both trips have been covered by alibis. Oswald's looking for a job. Now, this is the part of the summer where uh, they wait. They have to wait. This is the 28 days that you have to sit and wait. This was what the project was all about. She's made a positive cancer diagnosis. Okay, and it's a very aggressive form, so they know it's going to work. It's just how long is it going to take? And so they go back to New Orleans to wait and see if the 28-day threshold will keep. It's worked so far. It's worked with the mice. It's worked with the monkeys. Now they got to wait and see if it'll work with the humans. The suspicion is that it's going to. So the timeline so far, from beginning to where we are right now, this all started on May 15th, when both Lee Oswald and Judith Ferry arrive in New Orleans and secure the cover jobs at Riley Coffee. Okay, that's when all this begins. The August 31st is when the human test is complete. They've done the injections. They've gone back 2 days later and tested the blood. It's an aggressive cancer. It's taken in all three prisoners, and now they're waiting. And this is the month we talk about in earlier episodes where Oswald sort of goes dark, and so does Oswald, or so does Judith Ferry. And what we find out, if you read Judith Ferry's book, um, and there are some ancillary witnesses that could corroborate a detail here, a detail there. basically, I'm getting this information from Judith Ferry herself. And she said that we spent that pretty much that whole month living it up. Uh, we got to go to all these nice hotels. Carlos Marcelo comped us. So we got to stay in all these nice bridal suites or honeymoon suites, whatever. And we ate at all his restaurants, mainly the 500 club downtown, but other restaurants as well. We went to Audubon Park and we took walks and we read books and we took uh, we just lived it up for about 30 days, not quite 30 days, but most of about 3.5 weeks of September. And they just kind of went incognito and melted into each other's arms, rode the buses around, saw the tourist sites. I mean, he's from New Orleans. He knows New Orleans like the back of his hand. So he's showing her everything. And they're waiting to get word if the test worked or not. And Judith very says it in her book. She goes, we didn't realize it at the time. We'd made all these grand plans that we were going to reunite at some point down in Mexico and live happily ever after. But now I realize what this was. This was our final goodbyes. The people that were paying for all this, the people that were financing our little rendezvous, knew this was it for us. And and sort of giving us a send off. They'd seen us grow close during the course of the summer. They knew we were lovers, and they knew what was coming. We didn't. I didn't know, and to an extent, Oswald wasn't completely in the know, but certainly I didn't know. That's Judith Ferry talking. And so now I look back at it and I realize exactly what this was. I wondered why Carlos Marcelo was being so generous. He wasn't known to be that generous usually, but he was being exceedingly generous with us because he knew what was coming. And so this was like our reward for job well done. And so if you want an account of, she gives a day by day, almost minute by minute account of that month in her book, Me and Lee. It's pretty fascinating. But anyway, now that brings us to September 25. And uh, Oswald this is when they realize that they've been informed that the tests work, the prisoners have died. So now it's not about waiting for the prisoners to die. Now it's about the next step of the project, which, according to Oswald, what he's been told is it's his job to sneak it into Cuba. And so he prepares to leave New Orleans. And at this point, Judith Ferry is on her way to Florida. She's been released by a very angry Dr. Ochsner because of the letter she wrote about her objections to the human test. And so he basically sends her back to Florida to her parents' house with her tail between her legs. And he tells her, you will never work in medicine again. I mean, he threatens her. If you say anything about what you've seen, you will never work in medicine again. I will make sure. And he goes, when it comes to cancer research in America, I am the Maharashi, so to speak. I'm in charge, so I can prevent you from studying medicine, and I'm going to do that. He was angry with her. He was furious. He screamed and yelled. That was his reputation, and so much for going to Tulane Medical School. He reneged on that, and so she ends up going back to Florida, and now she's got to pick up the pieces of her life and figure out what to do next. So she's going back to Florida, and from now on, they're going to communicate by phone. And they still have these plans to get together and such, but they're separated now. And Oswald is preparing to go to Mexico City because that's where he's going to have to get the travel visa from the Cuban embassy to go to Cuba to make the drop. And there's been a lot of question about September 25th, about where Oswald was, because even the Warren Commission admits they know he bought a ticket. They know he bought a bus ticket. They know he went to the unemployment office and picked up his last unemployment check. They know that. They assume that he got on the bus because the bus goes to Houston, and he did get on the bus at Houston. But no one ever saw him on the bus from New Orleans to Houston. And the reason no one ever saw him on the bus from New Orleans to Houston, because he wasn't on the bus from New Orleans to Houston. He was going all over the place on a plane. And the pilot that's going to fly, his personal pilot for this day, is going to be Hugh Ward. who actually is Guy Bannister's pilot. So this is all CIA directed. Guy Bannister has arranged it. He's his handler. And he tells Hugh, he says, you're going to fly Oswald first to Austin. I have some files here, some paperwork, some legal files that need to be dropped off with LBJ's lawyers in downtown Austin. And so Oswald's going to be his sort of like his courier that day. So he's dropped this. This is an interesting side. When we get to the conspirators and talk about LBJ, this is sort of illuminating here that before the assassination, the people planning the assassination are having Oswald drop paperwork off with LBJ's lawyers in Austin. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Anyway, that's why he's going to Austin. So Hugh Ward's going to fly him to Austin. While he's there, he's got to secure an alibi. Remember, he can't let anybody know why he's really in Austin. He's really in Austin to meet with LBJ's lawyers. So he goes to the Capitol building and meets the Selective Service Office. He's been hassling with the Marine Corps about his discharge. When he was originally discharged, and then he went to Russia, he was given an honorable discharge. But then when it became public that he was giving secrets, military secrets to the Russians, the Marine Corps changed his discharge from honorable to dishonorable. And that's to sort of continue with the narrative that they didn't know what he was going to Russia to do. Now, once they know, they're going to change make a change to his discharge. Well, he wants to get it changed back to an honorable discharge. And this is all just a big charade is all it is. So he goes to the Selective Service Office and he meets with several people there and he hassles them and he's talking to them about his discharge. But the real reason he's there and why Hugh Ward flew him to Austin that day was to meet with LBJ's lawyers. But he got his alibi. The second stop, they go back to the airport, get back on the plane. Hugh Ward now flies him to Dallas. And the real purpose of that trip is to meet with Jack Ruby. Yes, the same Jack Ruby. The same Jack Ruby that he went to Cuba with to help get the release of Santos Traficante back after Fidel Castro put him in prison. The same Jack Ruby that Oswald met with during the summer and took him to lab number 2 and let him see the whole Medical Manhattan Project when Ruby came to New Orleans to buy Jada, the showgirl. This is the same Jack Ruby. The same Jack Ruby that will eventually shoot Oswald on November 24th. The guy the Warren Commission tells us Ruby and Oswald didn't know each other. Yeah, right. So anyway, he meets with Jack Ruby, but he's got to secure an alibi for that day as well. So we've talked about it previously. That evening, he goes with Leopoldo and Angel to Sylvia Odio's apartment, and he talks with Sylvia. And of course, Annie Odio is there, and she sees it. She sees him. She sees a guy that introduces himself as Leon Oswald. Of course, you remember the story. Leopoldo calls her back 2 days later, goes on and on about this Leon Oswald and how he's going on a trip. I mean, the name dropping and the alibi it's so thick. It's so rich, man. So they've got alibis secured for both Austin and for Dallas. They've successfully met with LBJ's lawyers and dropped off the files. He's successfully met with Jack Ruby. They got the alibis. And now they get back on the plane that night, and now they go to Houston. And that's where Oswald, the next morning, catches the bus from Houston to Laredo. The first leg of the bus trip is, and I'll show you here on a map. If you look at that top map, New Orleans to Houston is the first leg of that trip. That's September 25th. And of course, everybody sees him on the bus on the 26th. And so the Warren Commission could not figure out how he got on that bus because nobody saw him on the bus on the 25th. So they just intuited it. They just said, well, he had to have been on that bus. He bought a ticket. We know he bought a ticket. Witnesses saw him buy a ticket. He had a ticket in his pocket. We know he bought a ticket. We know he went to the unemployment office, got his last check. Then he went to the bus station, bought a ticket. We just didn't see him on the 25th, but we saw him on the 26th. So somehow he got from New Orleans to Houston. Well, what they don't account for, what they don't know, or they didn't want to know, is that he was really flying around Austin and Dallas with Hugh Ward doing Guy Bannister's bidding. and meeting with, because that would have been a real problem. You know, that the Warren Commission is going to come out later and say there was no connection between Oswald and Ruby. So you can't include that 25th trip to Dallas where he's meeting with Ruby. That contradicts their whole conclusion. So they just inferred that he was on the bus, and people just weren't very observant. They didn't see him, but he had the ticket, and that proves he was on the bus. According to the Warren Commission, we know he was not on that bus. He was on a plane. He was he was fulfilling. He was doing what Guy Bannister told him to do. Now he's on the bus. So on September 26th, he's on the bus from Houston to Laredo, and he's got his contact meets him in Houston and gives him, just like when he went to Jackson, the medical case and two thermoses. And in the thermoses, according to what he knows, is the cancer soup. So he's doing the same thing that he did when he went to Jackson twice. He's like what he did all summer. He's toting this bioweapon around. And his job is to meet his contact down in Mexico City and either make the drop there or smuggle it into Cuba himself. He's been told to get a travel visa, and he may have to go to Cuba himself and smuggle it in. But he's on the way to Mexico City. So, as I mentioned, the Warren Commission infers that he was on the bus on the 25th, and to make that work, they had to ignore the fact that he did meet with the Selective Service on the 25th in the morning at that Capitol. But that was a well-established fact, and they just had to ignore that. Which is what they did. And then they had to basically say that Sylvia Odio got her days confused and that he couldn't have been there when she said he was there because he was on that bus. So based on that, they said, well, he couldn't have been in your house because he was on that bus. He couldn't have been at the Selective Service house. He was on that bus. So the Warren Commission, you see, here's a case where they have already made up their mind. And despite the evidence sitting in front of their face, they're going to say, no, that evidence can't be right because he was on that bus. Well, do you have any evidence he was on that bus? Well, no, but he did buy a ticket, so he had to be on that bus. And of course, he has to be on that bus to make their timeline work, to make the cover story work. All right, so now he is across the border and he's into Mexico City. And here's where David Atlee Phillips and the disinformation campaign begins. He is in Mexico City. This is why I believe he was there. David Atlee Phillips will later come out and disavow the whole thing because the story falls apart. I believe he was there. I believe he was 100% there. Judith Very tells the story. They talk on the phone and he reports back to her everything that happened when he was there. And he's specific about it. There are a lot of details there. So he was there, but the CIA doesn't want to admit why he was there, which is why they later disavow the story. But right now, they're trying to create a cover story, and they think this is going to be handy because he's going to Mexico City. He thinks he's going there to get a passport to go to Cuba, and he's going to hand this bioweapon off to a Cuban contact. He thinks he's going to hand these thermoses off to his contact there, and he's getting his travel visa. And he thinks it's because we're just telling him to do this. He doesn't know why, unless for some reason his contact doesn't show, then he has to smuggle it himself into Cuba. He's just following orders. What he doesn't realize is in that thermos is a placebo. It's not the real bioweapon. He's on a wild goose chase. He's being sheep dipped. And he realizes this when his contact never shows. And so then all of a sudden it becomes, Oswald's never failed in a mission. This is going to go down as a failure. And so he's trying to figure out how can my contact, he waits and waits as long as he can. And the contact never shows. And so he decides, well, I'm going to get that travel visa and go myself. And that's fine for the people that are sheep dipping him. That's all the better. He's trying to go to Cuba, right? Because they are going to change the purpose of this little Mexico City jaunt to what we've already discussed before. He's in and out the Soviet embassy, the Cuban embassy, and we talked about how he went 3 times to the Cuban embassy, and he made a big scene each time. He gets kicked out a couple of times. He goes to the Soviet embassy, makes a big scene, pulls out his pistol, puts it down on the desk, and said, "I can't wait 6 months for this travel visa. This won't work for me. My story is going to end in a tragedy." All this stuff. drawing all this attention to himself. But that's not him. According to Sylvia Duran, that's this guy. That's this guy here, this doppelganger who's making all that big scene. The real Oswald is waiting in Mexico City for his contact. When his contact doesn't show, he tries to enter the Cuban embassy, but when he goes, he arrives with a friend of his who is he's a CIA asset down in Mexico City. He's a cutout. And Oswald from a previous mission knows this guy. He's got blonde hair and he has a very distinctive look to him. When he goes to the Cuban embassy to try to secure his travel visa, he and this cutout go together. And this doesn't work for the CIA taking pictures. They can't show Oswald with another CIA agent arriving at the Cuban embassy. They can't show that other guy. And so instead of using the photos of the real Oswald is why they have to use these photos. You know, the question was always, why would you use these obvious photos that are not Oswald? Why would you use these to try to pin the blame on Oswald and try to say this is Oswald? Why would you use such photos that are obviously not him? They couldn't use the real Oswald because Oswald went to the Cuban embassy with somebody who's from the CIA, a cutout whom he knew from a previous mission. And the guy was just trying to help him. He didn't know the larger plan. Oswald talks to him, says, my contact didn't show. You got to help me get a visa so I can go to Cuba. So they go to the Cuban embassy together. And the cameras pick up Oswald arriving at the Cuban embassy, but he's with his friend. They take photos and they realize, the CIA realizes they can't use those photos. So they have to use these photos. And that becomes a real problem, obviously. So the doppelganger, pictured here, lays this trail, this real incriminating trail, makes the big scene, meets with Valery Kostakov, who is he's the guy that the Russians, he works for the KGB and he's the assassination expert. And this is all being put together in a nice little cover story to implicate the real Oswald. And this is when Richard Nagel enters the scene. So that happens. That's the Mexico City saga. And that now we fast forward to November 18th. And we're 4 days before the assassination now. And this is when Richard Nagel, and remember, he has he is wise to this CIA plan to kill JFK and set up Oswald. We told that story in an earlier episode. He was a counterintelligence agent. His job assigned by the KGB was to get close to Oswald, stay close to him. They knew he's a fake defector. They knew he had some mission that was important. And so ever since he returned from Russia, Nagel's been on his case. He's been watched. And of course, Nagel and Oswald are close. They know each other. And so it's easy. He just follows him around. He hangs with him. He finds out what he's up to, and he discovers that Oswald has infiltrated this plot to kill Kennedy. And so he reports back to the KGB, listen, Oswald is part of something. The CIA is planning to kill Kennedy when he goes to Dallas. And what Oswald doesn't realize that he's the guy being set up to be the patsy. And so you remember what they tell Nagel, they said, well, you got to tell him. Because if they implicate him, they're implicating us. They're going to say, well, he went to Russia, he married a Russian woman, he gave the Russians military secrets. He just got back from Mexico City. He met in the Cuban embassy, went to the Soviet embassy. It's clear why he was they're going to make it look like he's trying to go to Cuba and escape after the assassination. They're going to make it look like this was an order by Fidel Castro. This is all about implicating Oswald to implicate the Soviets, to implicate the communists, to justify a war in Cuba. And so they're saying, you got to tell him, we got to sabotage this whole thing. He cannot be made into this patsy because that makes us the patsy. Or that puts the finger of blame on us. And if he doesn't listen to you, you got to kill him. Well, you remember Nagel wouldn't kill him. So Nagel goes and gives himself, he does tell him, Oswald doesn't believe him at the time. By the time we get to November 18th, he's starting to believe him. But anyway, you remember Nagel, he goes into that bank, he shoots the bank, the top, the ceiling, and he goes out and sits in the car and waits to be arrested. And he tells the arresting officer, I'd rather be in prison or been in a jail cell than commit murder or treason. because he's looked at his options and he says, the KGB wants me to kill Oswald. That's murder. And the CIA wants me to go along with a plot to kill the president. That's treason. Either way, I'm screwed. So I'm just going to put myself in this jail cell, which he does. And he ends up spending almost 5 years in prison over this whole thing. And then we talked about his life story, what happens afterwards. But because of Nagel, the KGB knows what the CIA is up to. All right, they're wise to it. They know the whole thing. They know Alpha 66 is in a plot to kill the president. Leopoldo and Angel have been following Oswald around. Their job is to set him up to be the patsy. They know all this. Well, then on November 18th, a letter arrives at the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. And allegedly, it's a letter from Oswald. And it's typed, which clues him in right away. This can't be from Oswald. He's written us several letters before. He always handwrites his letters. And in this letter, Oswald is basically talking about how he met with Kostakov in Mexico City, and he went to the Soviet embassy, and it's just very incriminating information. It's corroborating information from the man himself, or from the alleged man himself, that he was in Mexico City to meet with the assassination expert, to get travel visas to either Cuba or Russia. And he's writing this letter like he's reporting it to the Soviets, like they told him to do all this stuff. He's saying, this is what I did, this is how it went, blah, blah, blah. And like, this is not a letter from Oswald. The KGB is on to it. They suspect right away that this is a forgery. The fact that it's typed and it's so incriminating, and because they have this background information from Richard Nagel, they know that Oswald is being set up, and so they view this letter as part of the setup. And so we get to, they've got this letter, and immediately they cable home back to Moscow, and they say, we got to figure out what to do about this because we can't get caught with this letter. The FBI reads our mail. Any piece of mail that comes to the American embassy, the FBI gets a hold of, just like the Russians do our mail. You remember when Oswald sent a letter in Moscow in Minsk to Moscow to the American embassy so he could come home. The Russians, the KGB, intercepted the letter, copied it, and they knew what his plans were. That's when they began to know he was a fake defector. Everybody does this. So they know the FBI has a copy of this letter. They're like, holy cow, you know what's going to happen? They're going to release this letter publicly. When the Mexico City story drops, when the CIA drops this Mexico City story, which is a hugely incriminating story towards Oswald, then independently they'll release this story, they'll leak it, and it will corroborate the Mexico City story. When the CIA comes out and said, hey, this guy Oswald met with Kostakov. He went to the Soviet embassy. He went to the Cuban embassy. He did all this stuff. He's trying to find an escape plan afterwards. He's trying to plan the assassination. Castro and the communists are pulling his strings, and they're pushing him around the chessboard like a piece. They're going to drop that Mexico City story. Well, right afterwards, the FBI is going to drop in concert with that. They're going to leak this story, and it's going to corroborate it in Oswald, allegedly Oswald's own hand. It's actually typed, and it's going to be a slam dunk. And so they realize we got to do something because this is part of the setup that we know is going on. They realize that the CIA, after the assassination takes place, the CIA does release the Mexico City to the public. Almost immediately. And in order to buttress their case, the CIA makes sure that the FBI knows that they have photographic evidence to prove that Oswald was at the Cuban embassy and the Soviet embassy. And when they show them that photographic evidence, that picture I just showed you, it's pretty clear to the FBI right away, this isn't the right guy. This isn't, do you have any other evidence? Oh yeah, we have voice recordings of him meeting with Valery Kostakov. And so then they listened to the voice recordings, and the FBI agents, 8 of them who interviewed or interrogated Oswald after he was arrested, said unanimously, they all said the same thing. That's not Oswald's voice. So the CIA had this master plan to drop the story, to release the photo if they needed it, to release the voice recordings if they needed to back it up, and then release this letter the FBI is going to release this letter that they had intercepted, going to this Soviet embassy, and that would back it up even further. But the story starts falling apart immediately because the picture's not him, the voice recording's not him. J. Edgar Hoover, in a meeting the next day to LBJ, LBJ brings it up. What about this Mexico City thing? And J. Edgar Hoover just tells him flat out, it's not him. It's not him. The photos are not him. The voice recordings, all our agents listen to, it's not him. And then when we ask for the tapes to bring back and run through our whatever kind of testing they had, the CIA said that they lost the tapes, so they destroyed the tapes. And then you got these doppelganger stories going on. You got the Odio sisters coming and saying, well, we saw him on the 25th. And the Mercury Ford auto dealership said, well, he came in, he test drove a car on the 25th. And all of a sudden, we got all kinds of problems with this story. You got sightings of Oswald when the Warren Commission and the FBI and the CIA say he's on a bus going to Mexico City. And they said, well, no, we saw him in Dallas. There's a problem. And then when he was in Mexico City, the photos don't match him. The voice recordings don't match him. Nothing matches. So the story is just falling apart around him. And so the FBI tries a rescue operation. We talked about this in an earlier episode where they go to Fenella Farrington. They found out that she had been in Mexico City. And there was a picture of her talking with Oswald in New Orleans, not Mexico City, in New Orleans. And so they, since she had been in Mexico City, they go to her, and she just coincidentally lived in Washington. And they said, we need you to say that you were meeting with Oswald, or you met Oswald, you spoke with Oswald at the embassy in Mexico City when you were there. And she says, well, that's me right there in that picture in New Orleans. I don't know this guy. I don't know what the circumstances are, why I was talking to. I don't know this guy. And I certainly didn't meet with him or talk to him in Mexico City. And so she wouldn't go along with the story. But they want her to admit that that she met with him. They go to Sylvia Duran, pictured at the bottom here, and they want her to testify that the doppelganger that came into the Cuban embassy 3 times and made the big scene was really Oswald. They show her the picture of Oswald who's been arrested, and they want her to corroborate that. Then they want to release this letter to the public that came to the Soviet embassy to corroborate all this. And if they can get these 3 things to happen, if they can get Fenella Farrington on board, if they can get Sylvia Duran to corroborate, and if they can release this letter, now understand, the FBI has no idea that the KGB knows, is onto them. The CIA doesn't know. Nobody on our side knows that the KGB knows. So they're still planning to release this letter. By the way, if you're a student of history, this sounds so much like the loan letter, which got us into the Spanish-American War. If you're familiar with that, that was a letter allegedly by the Spanish ambassador who called the American president McKinley a weak and stupid politician. It got leaked to the American press, which was yellow. Our press was basically controlled by the government. It was two guys owned all the press, right? Pulitzer on one coast and Hearst on the other. They worked hand in hand with the government, and the government wanted this war. And so they released this letter and published it in all the papers. The American people lose their minds. This is right after the Maine blows up. And so those 2 events is what got us into the war. There's a lot of suspicion because the Spanish ambassador denied ever writing that letter. There's a lot of suspicion that letter was a forgery, but it brought about a desired result. You think about World War I. What was one of the things that got us in World War I? It was the Zimmerman note. The Zimmerman note, in conjunction with the Lusitania going down, was a note allegedly by the German foreign minister to Mexico saying, if you'll help us in the war against America, which is coming, when we win, we'll give you back all the territory that you lost to America as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, all that stuff. And of course, that gets released to the press and gets published. The American people are furious. And there's a lot of suspicion that the Zimmerman note was fabricated as well. So whether or not those 2 cases are fabrications, there's a lot of suspicion because both people that were accused of writing those letters denied it. And but the desired result in both cases was we went to war. So here we have a similar situation where if we can get Fenella Farrington on board, if we can get Sylvia Duran on board, if we can get this letter released to back up the Mexico City story, story, then the American people are going to be so furious. The American target has been taken out by JFK. And according to this evidence that's being released, it's by uh, at the hand of the Soviets or the hands of the Cubans. And so it'll justify, we're not going to go to war with the Soviets for sure, but we'll go to war with Cuba in a heartbeat, which is really what we want. So there's a pattern here. If you're careful and you know history a little bit, you can look back and see that pattern, and you're like, wait a second, uh, letter war, letter war. Here's another one, letter hoping to go to war. It looks like a pattern repeating itself. Well, the story is not going to work, thankfully, because Fenella Farrington courageously says, I'm not going to participate in your little sham. I didn't meet with Oswald in Mexico City. I'm not going to say that I did. I'm not going to manufacture evidence. I'm not going to lie. So strike her out. Sylvia Duran, in spite of being tortured, because our CIA and FBI tell the Mexican authorities, can't go arrest her and torture her, beat a confession out of her, or get her to corroborate this story. And she wouldn't. She said, no, the Oswald I met with was 5'3". He had blonde hair, blue-green eyes. He was not the same Oswald that you're showing me. It's not the same guy. And so they're striking out. Then the Soviets strike on the 26th of November, 4 days after the assassination. The Soviets, through official channels, tell the American government, inform the American government that they are going to release a letter that it received at its embassy from Lee Harvey Oswald publicly, along with a formal accusation from the Soviet government that the CIA has concocted this letter. It's a forgery. They have evidence there is a scheme to frame Lee Harvey Oswald, and this is part of the scheme. And they're going to publicly release this along with a formal charge, because they believe that Oswald is being set up so that they are being set up. Holy cow. So this is when all of a sudden David Atlee Phillips and the CIA has to disavow the story, because you can't release it now. You can't release that letter now. You can't. Now you can't cast any doubt on the cover story. So they eventually have to disavow their Mexico City fiction, even though it still makes its way into the Warren Report in '64. They didn't release the letter, but they allowed the Warren Commission to operate under the impression that everything that they said about Mexico City was true. They just don't have any evidence of it. And it's kind of like the bus, when they said, well, he had to have been on the bus. He had to have been on the bus on the 25th because he was on the bus on the 26th. Well, here's the CIA. And of course, who's the guy running the Warren Commission? It's Allen Dulles. It's called the Warren Commission. That was just a figurehead. The guy running it is Allen Dulles, former head of the CIA. He's running this thing. A lot of witnesses said they might as well call it the Dulles Commission. He ran it. He was the only one who didn't have a full-time job. This was his full-time job. He was there every meeting. No one else was. He ran this thing. And so he's going to allow this story to persist, that Oswald was in Mexico City, at least through the 64, when the Warren Report is published. And then afterwards, they're going to have, when researchers start pulling up this evidence that I'm telling you, they're going to have to disavow the story, which they do. Look at the genius, I guess is what you would call it, of the disinformation that's coming out of David Atlee. Remember, that is his expertise. When it comes to the CIA, that's what he does. He's a disinformation specialist. So he's putting all this cover story together. When Oswald goes to Jackson, the real purpose is to inject the prisoners. He gets an alibi, stops in Clinton, talks about getting a job. When he goes back to Jackson, the real purpose is to do the blood work. He gets an alibi. He stops at a barber shop with Judith Very on the way into town, and there's a bunch of people in there. He goes in and gets a haircut, even though he didn't need one. And he asks the barber, where could I go to talk about getting a job? Even though he's already done all this. He's talking to another guy, somebody new. Where can I go to talk about getting a job at the mental hospital? And the barber tells him there's a state senator who lives on the outskirts of town. It's a couple miles out. He works at the state hospital too. He can get you a job. He's got connections there. So they actually go after they go to the hospital and do all their, doing the blood work. That on their way out of town, they stop at the state senator's house, and he walks up the long lane and he talks to the state senator on the porch. The state senator remembers the conversation. It's all about this job. He even looks out and sees a young woman sitting in the car. It's Judith Ferry. So alibi. When Oswald goes to Austin, the real purpose is to go to LBJ Lawyers, drop off some papers. His alibi is the Selective Service Office. When he goes to Dallas, it's to meet with Ruby. What's the alibi? Sylvia Odio's apartment. You know, when he goes to Mexico City, the real purpose is to make the bioweapon drop. Well, David Atlee Phillips comes up with an alibi for that as well. The alibi is he's meeting with Kostikov. That's the Soviet expert on assassinations. He makes multiple trips to the Cuban embassy looking for a travel visa so that he can, and he did go to the Cuban embassy looking for a travel visa, but he thinks it's because his contact didn't show, and he's got to take the bioweapon to Cuba himself. Of course, David Atlee Phillips is going to say, no, this is so he has an escape route after he commits the assassination. He can go to Cuba. He goes to the Soviet embassies, and that's where he meets Kostikov. So the Soviets are helping him plan this assassination, helping him plan a getaway. And they're all in this together to get him a travel visa. And that's the story that they want the public to know. So why? What's the point of it all? The point of it all, it's a setup. It's to create a pretext for war. That's what Northwoods, we talked about Operation Northwoods a couple episodes ago. That's what Northwoods was all about. It was to take out a prominent American target and place the blame on somebody that didn't do it. It's false flag, but you can set it up to make it look like they did it so that the American people will be forced to go to war with them. So the change of plans, unbeknownst to Oswald, is that we're not going to use the bio. All summer long, you've been working on this bioweapon, but we're not going to use it against Castro because we found a better way to take out Castro, and the better way is to foment a war, because we have two problems right now. The two problems are JFK and Castro. JFK is making peace with Castro. He won't let us kill Castro. So we got to take him out first. Well, that's going to happen in Dallas. And then we're going to pin the blame on Oswald, which is going to reflect on Castro, Cuba, and the Soviets. And that's going to justify a war with Cuba. And we can take out Castro when we go to war with Cuba. So we'll kill two birds with one stone. We'll get the war we always wanted. We'll get Castro and his government gone. And we can go back to resuming business as usual in Cuba. So all they did is take the infrastructure of a plot to assassinate Castro, which we will talk about later when we get to the S-Force. We'll talk about this infrastructure. This was an actual trained force to use high caliber weapons from distance with scopes on a moving target. They were training to kill Castro from distance because all the attempts to get close to him had failed. They just take that infrastructure of that plot and they turn it and they say, well, we'll use it in Dallas first. We need it there. We need people that have been trained to hit moving targets from distance with high-powered rifles with scopes. And that's exactly how Kennedy gets killed. And so since Kennedy's coming to Dallas, November 22nd, and it's time now to bring the patsy to Dallas after the Mexico City saga, Oswald is ordered, he's redirected, he's sent to Dallas. And they say, we need you to come to Dallas for a debriefing. But the whole point of it, that's going to be the new place where he was in New Orleans all summer doing what they told him to do there, working for Guy Bannister. Now he's being transferred. He's given new orders to go to Dallas, and he'll have a new handler there, which we'll talk about later. So the Mexico City story is concocted for four purposes. A, it's to divert attention away from his real purpose. That whole bioweapon project, Medical Manhattan, was to culminate in him going to Cuba or dropping it at Mexico City with his contact so he could take it to Cuba, right? And secondly, it's to direct attention towards a communist conspiracy involving Oswald, the Soviets, Castro, and a plot to kill JFK. Right? That's why you have him at the Soviet embassy, the Cuban embassy. That's why you have him meeting Kostikov. That's why you have him in Mexico City to begin with. All right. So you're diverting attention at the same time you're directing attention towards. Uh, I was doing a little research on the CIA. This was a while back. And in the 40s and 50s, Alan Dulles hired a guy who was a prominent magician in a circus. He was a magician that traveled around. He traveled around the world. He was one of the most prominent magicians in the world, and his expertise was getting people. You know, he's a magician, so he'll do these tricks, and they're so quick that the human eye doesn't see how he actually accomplished it. And Dulles was fascinated by that. And he brought him in to train his CIA assets in the master or in the art of diversion. And it's one of the CIA traits. They get you looking at this over here while something else happens over here. Like you look at assassinations, there's always a diversionary shot first that gets everybody's attention looking over here while the real shot happens behind you. You know, so same thing here with this story. Divert attention away from Oswald's real purpose to direct attention towards the fake purpose. And then ultimately, what this is designed to do after you've taken out JFK and you've blamed it on Cuba is to force the American people's hands, which would result in a war, just like the DeLome letter, just like the Zimmerman note, Spanish-American War, World War I, and now here, this is going to force a war between us and Cuba. And then lastly, it was used as a way to contain the Warren Commission. And that, by that, what I mean is the CIA is going to come in, and so is the FBI, and they're going to come in, they're going to tell the Warren Commission right off the bat, all our evidence points to Lee Harvey Oswald being a lone gunman. And the Warren Commission is not a fact-finding investigative body of its own. They just take whatever evidence the FBI gives them, the CIA gives them. And so in order to contain, so they just take at face value what the CIA and FBI is saying, it must have been a lone gunman. That keeps the Warren Commission from possibly investigating or following leads that might lead to the Soviets, might lead to the Cubans, might lead to a war. In fact, if you think about it, mainly with the Soviets, we were really afraid of a war with the Soviets. We don't want a war with the Soviets. We want a war with Cuba, but not with the Soviets. And if you think about it, that's how LBJ got Warren, Chief Justice Earl Warren, to even serve on the commission to begin with. Earl Warren didn't want to serve. And LBJ says, well, if you don't, you could be responsible for a war between us and the Soviets that'll cost 45 million Americans their lives. Do you want that kind of blood on your hands? They said, Warren, witnesses said when he emerged from LBJ's office, he was crying. And he agreed to do it. He felt bullied into it, but he didn't want to be responsible for a war. And so what this Mexico City story does is the CIA, I can just imagine Dulles sitting there and explaining to the commissioners about this Mexico City saga and the implications of it. Fellas, we know he met with Kostikov. We know he's the KGB expert in assassinations. This trail, if we follow it and we make it public, leads back to the Soviets. It could lead to a war between us and the Soviets. Or we could contain it to Oswald and say a lone gunman did it. And he acted on his own, of his own volition. He's trying, whatever motivation. He's a loner, he's a nut, whatever. So you choose how you want this to go. If we follow the Mexico City story and investigate it too thoroughly, it might lead to a war with the Soviets, 45 million dead Americans, or we can just keep it contained. And the Warren Commission basically went with that story, and they published the Mexico City story as if it was fact, put the pictures in, the exhibits, everything. But they didn't follow it through. They didn't investigate. They just took whatever the CIA said about it, took their word for it, and stopped. They just cut it off at that. They didn't want to know. It's like, hear no evil, see no evil. This has got to stop with Oswald. It can't go any further. So in a way, the Mexico City story was brilliant. It didn't work in getting us into war with Cuba. It fell apart later and became a huge indicator that Oswald was set up in this whole thing, and it was a CIA operation. But that was years later. That was years down the road. When it mattered, the Warren Commission bought the story, hook, line, and sinker, and didn't investigate it lest there be a war with the Soviets. took whatever the CIA said about it and put it in the Warren Report. And that became the gospel. That became what the American people believed. For decades, everybody believed it. Oswald went to Mexico City to plan his escape, to talk with the Soviets about an assassination, and to conspire with the Cubans and all this. And none of it was true. That was the disinformation. That was the false story. That was the alibi. He was in Mexico City, but not for the purposes the CIA said. Because imagine if they do acknowledge that he was there, but not for the reason they said, somebody's going to want to know why. And they're going to start investigating this bioweapon. And it's going to lead back to what happened in New Orleans and how they perverted science to take a vaccine and make a bioweapon out of it. And then someone's going to start asking about that vaccine. How could it be perverted so easily? What? Because it has cancer in it. And then that goes back to the 50s when 198 million Americans got inoculated with a contaminated vaccine. I mean, the story has so many legs. So when he did go to Mexico City, and they have to come up with an alibi to say why he was there. And the alibi falls apart later. But when they needed it for the purposes of the Warren Commission, it was still standing because the Warren Commission didn't investigate it. They just took whatever Alan Dulles said and they just verbatim and published it. So I tell you, this story has so many twists and turns in it. And for me, the illuminating moment was obviously I went back and forth for years on the Mexico City stuff. And I finally came to the conclusion when I was able to independently verify, at least to my satisfaction, Judith Ferry's story, that he did go to Mexico City. And then it all made sense. Why would you go to such lengths to make a story that's so obviously false? The CIA, that could, just a little bit of investigating, you could figure out that it was false, unless you're trying to hide something. And the only thing they would be trying to hide, is what he was doing in New Orleans in the summer of '63, which is why the CIA fought so hard against Jim Garrison when he brings that trial against Clay Shaw, because Garrison's getting close. He's investigating the New Orleans angle. The New Orleans angle is so important. It shows the JFK assassination plot to be much bigger than you think. It's not just the assassination of the president. It's about getting us in a war. It's about protecting a secret about a vaccine and a bioweapon. There's so much involved in it. So that's why they fought so hard, or David Atlee Phillips had to come up with this story. And like I said, it fell apart. But for the purposes that they needed, it got them through the Warren Commission. And of course, you all know the Warren Commission became the Bible. And you still look up history books. I've got a history book sitting right over there that my students read every day that still says Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone killing the president. And it's total poppycock. But it's in the textbooks, it's in the movies, it's in the books, it's in the national consciousness. It's become accepted fact. Adolf Hitler used to say, you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it. More people will believe it. And so on my website, right at the top, it's also on this YouTube channel, I quote Mark Twain. I think it was Mark Twain who said this. Sometimes people say it came from somebody else before him, but anyway, I attribute it to Mark Twain. He said, a lie goes around the world 7 times before the truth gets out of town. And this whole Mexico City thing, all those alibis, those are the lies. And that became the conventional wisdom. That became the accepted fact. It took decades to painstaking research to tear those myths apart and come up with the truth. And in some people's minds and eyes, they still believe the lie. So that's why we exist. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I teach it to my students, because I think truth matters. So I hope you enjoyed today. I went on long. I apologize. I won't do it again. I'll try not to anyway. There was just so much information, and I didn't want to break it into 2. I wanted it all to be one. So maybe you can watch this in 2 installments to keep it shorter. But check out my website, sphistory.com. If you like what you're seeing, what you're hearing, feel free to subscribe to my channel. It's free. Feel free to hit the notification bell, thumbs up, and I appreciate it. keep the comments coming. It's great. I'm learning from you. We're learning from each other. We're creating a dialogue, and that's what we're trying to do. So until next time, everybody have a great day. We'll see you on the flip side. Thank you.